The Air Transport Auxiliary holds a fascinating place in the annals of the Second World War. The men and women of the ATA literally flew anything to anywhere, ensuring that the RAF's frontline squadrons were equipped with the very latest aircraft coming out of factories and maintenance units across the United Kingdom. In 1942, however, a group of intrepid American aviatrixes arrived in the UK under the tutelage command of the intrepid Jackie Cochran, and their arrival caused a bit of a stir and a bit of a culture clash. In her new book, Spitfires, Becky Aikman discusses and delves into that incredible group of women who arrived to do their part on the front lines of the Second World War. And this week on the Aviation Show, brought to you as always by the fabulous Pima Air and Space Museum in Tucson, Arizona, we're going to be learning about a few of those amazing women who would walk out to an aircraft with nothing more than one of these to tell them how to fly it. Let's chat to Becky. Becky, thank you so much for joining us. This is really exciting. I'm a big fan of the ATA, and I've covered Pauline Gower in the past. And my dad went up in a cherry picker with Diana Bernardo Walker once, and I didn't get to meet her. And it's one of the big regrets of my airplane, because he had a fantastic time with her, and I unfortunately was busy showing show jumpers around where they had to go, so my priorities were slightly all over the place at the time.
Yes, big personality, and that would have been fun to meet her for sure.
Oh yeah, he dines out on the fact as well that he got to spend a half hour 150 feet above the Eden Bridge in Oxted agricultural showground with one of the most famous ATA pilots of all time. But we're not going to be talking about her today. No. We're talking about your girls. So I guess the introductory question is, how did you come to the story of the American ladies who came across to fly for the ATA? Had you known about it, or was it a sudden discovery for you?
I did not know about it, and practically no one in the United States knows that these women served there. They were, in fact, the first American women to fly military aircraft. If you looked that up when I started, you couldn't find any evidence of that. It happened through pure chance. I was talking to my mother, who had been a young child during World War II, and I told her that I was hoping I could write a book about people who did something extraordinary, but no one has heard of them. And she immediately said, "You should write about the American women who flew in England during the war." I said, "That sounds interesting. I, in fact, have never heard of it." And I started looking around for information about it and realized that nobody seemed to have heard about it, and I couldn't find anything. So I approached my mother and I said, "Are you sure you didn't have it mixed up with something like the WASP?" And that didn't go over well. She said, "No, I remember so distinctly. She had seen something like a newsreel, and she said, 'I thought they were so noble and glamorous. I wished I could do what they did.'" And it stuck with her all her life. So I thought, well, it's my mother. I better pursue this some more. So I did eventually learn about the ATA and that American women had been in it. And I called the person who runs the museum for the ATA in Maidenhead. And he started sounding just like my mother. He said, "I hope you don't plan to fictionalize this, because nothing could be as exciting and glamorous as the reality." So I knew I was onto a really good story. I realized very quickly that the ATA itself was a great story, but it was too much to cover in a book without confusing everyone. So I thought this was ideal. I'll focus on this small group of Americans, people who were in a faraway land, adapting to all the wartime things, and look at it through that lens, so it was easier for readers to follow the more limited number of characters.
Because I think that's probably not overly surprising, because the WASPs hold this fantastic, well-deserved place in sort of American aviation history. But this group, and I suppose the ATA itself, doesn't really get that same sort of crossover to the sort of the general history of the Second World War in the States.
It definitely does not. And I think it was because they weren't a part of the American military. So people doing research about the war just didn't think to look into this small niche of people who were serving in Great Britain. So I really have the story to myself, which was great and also hard, because these people were not famous enough that there was much material in the public domain about them. A few had left diaries or letters to some museums or other archives, but most had just disappeared completely. The very first thing I did was I went to the San Diego Air and Space Museum because I knew the name of one of the pilots and I saw that she had some papers there. I arrived and it was not promising. The librarian said, "Oh, you're the first person who's ever asked to see this." So I opened it up and she came alive for me. She was such a dramatic person. Her name was Mary Zerbel, and she was actually very famous before and during the war. She had been the youngest woman flying instructor in the United States, so newspapers covered her many exploits. It also helped that she was very pretty and they liked to take her picture. And in England, she was, an excellent pilot, but she also became, with her fiance, the first American couple to marry in the war zone in August 1942, before most Americans were there. They wanted to have a quiet wedding, but the press got wind of it and it made international headlines. Also partly because she was very pretty, I'm sure. I realized she had this dramatic life. There was much more to it during the war, after the war. In fact, I got deeper into her file and saw that a movie had been made based on her life, starring Lana Turner. But then I got to the very end of the file, and there was her obituary. It had appeared in a small newspaper in Idaho. It was only 3 sentences, and it never even mentioned that she knew how to fly. So I thought immediately, someone's got to do something about this. I have to make sure these interesting and trailblazing people get the recognition they deserved.
And you've done a fab job. We'll just put that in straight away. I thoroughly enjoyed the book. It was a lot of fun. And I guess let's just take the next little while just to do a potted history because, dear viewer, listener, go buy the book. It's really good. Links in the description below, all that good stuff. But I suppose we have to sort of start at the beginning because we need to talk about a remarkable woman with a very complex reputation and legacy. Because how did this group get brought together, and who was the woman whose idea this was to take American aviatrixes out to this war zone?
She was Jackie Cochran. She was the most famous woman aviatrix of her era after Amelia Earhart disappeared. Jackie won many, many cross-country air races, set many records for speed and distance between various cities. She won many awards. She was known internationally. And it was all quite interesting. As you say, she was complex. She had grown up quite impoverished. She started working in a factory at the age of 8. She was uneducated, and I discovered that she was, in fact, illiterate and hid that by always hiring a secretary, which she could do because she became a self-made millionaire. Jackie Cochran had tremendous drive. She started her own cosmetics company and became very wealthy. She married a wealthy man. She decided to use this wealth to pursue this activity of flying in races and other competitive situations because she was very competitive. Now, as the war approached, she had hoped that the United States would start a unit for women pilots. And she had the connections to make it happen. She knew Eleanor Roosevelt. She knew General Hap Arnold, very high level in arranging the war. And she lobbied and failed. Everyone said, no, we're not going to let American women fly in military aircraft. But she did know about the ATA and knew that it did accept women. So she decided, because when Jackie decided something, she did it. She would contact the top women flyers in the United States and invite them to join her in the ATA. So a group of these women received this telegram out of the blue from this world famous flyer. They were so excited, and it sounded like a dream come true. They would fly all the most advanced aircraft in the world. They would be in the war zone, which they wanted to be. They wanted to serve. So they all went to Montreal to pass a flight test, and ultimately 25 of them passed that test and got on cargo ships with an array of people heading that direction, while submarines were prowling all about, and made their way to England to serve in the war.
I suppose we also have to ask, what was Jackie Cochran's idea of what she would be doing when she arrived? Because we've mentioned her sort of her drive, and her story is remarkable, but she's also, let's say, very sure of herself, isn't she?
Yes, she had a poor adjustment to life in the United Kingdom. Jackie wanted to be in charge of stuff, and she wanted to use this experience to prove to the Americans that women could do this work. So she wanted to spend her time swanning about in a Rolls Royce, wearing a fur coat, and keeping records with the help of her secretary of how well the women were doing, so that she could then communicate this to American officials who were following her every move. The British had the attitude, there's a war on, you're a good pilot, you should fly like everybody else. There were many top British pilots who, as I'm sure you know, flew for the ATA, the also extremely famous Amy Johnson, who had made world headlines with her aviation feats. And she flew like a regular pilot. So there was an immediate disconnect between Jackie and the officials. And she ultimately complained that flying in open cockpit planes aggravated her sinuses. So they took her out of active duty and gave her a fancy title. But essentially, she had very little to actually do, and left by September of 1942 to, in fact, go back and help to run the WASP in the United States, which started that fall.
Because I think that short period, the sort of that complex situation between herself, Pauline Gower, who was wired into everyone through her father, and of course she'd run her own airline and things like that. So they both have interesting parallels, but different stresses. And when you hit England in the 1940s, if you're not of the class, you're not going to butt heads, because it's a culture clash that the women hit when they arrive, isn't it? Because there's a very famous incident in Liverpool, isn't there?
Yes. To continue for a moment with Jackie, she had this platinum blonde hair. She was in full makeup, always dressed to the nines. The British considered her loud and vulgar, and
I think they say that about most foreigners. I think.
Well,
as a Canadian who lives here, of course, I can get away with that.
11, so it just wasn't going to work with her. But with the others, it was also a problem from the beginning. The first shipload of Americans, there were 5 of them on that ship. They arrived in Liverpool, and they were met by Pauline Gower and other officials of the ATA, women officials, who were all rather formal and prim. The Americans had been waiting to go through customs on their ship. They had spent 3 weeks crossing the Atlantic in grave danger of being sunk by submarines. So they spent that waiting period having a few drinks to celebrate. They sashayed down the gangplank of the ship. They were kissing the members of the crew goodbye. You can only imagine the look on Pauline Gower's face. And then she said something very formal, like, well, I'm sure you're very tired, but if you would like to join us for dinner tonight, please do if you feel like it, which they did not realize meant that she was saying, I'm your commanding officer. You will join me for dinner. So they all said, oh, yes, very nice, fine, thanks, and didn't show up. So she left on a train that night, leaving them to find their own way to London the next day. So they created a very poor impression from the beginning, and they didn't help themselves in the early days either. They were young women. They were, some of them, pretty wild. They were there to have a great time as well as to fly. So there was a lot of drinking and carousing and love affairs going on as well.
The thing that sort of jumped out at me in this sort of section of your book is their realization of suddenly being in a war zone.
Yes.
London, for all of its fame and glitz, was a pretty grim place during the 40s. That sort of, I guess, brought it home to them what they were in for.
Yes, the British were rather shocked at the Americans. British women who flew were more upper crust generally, The Americans, as we'll discuss, I'm sure, were a real mix of all layers of society. So there was that disconnect. But the Americans were also shocked. They knew there was a war on, but when they got there, Liverpool was so desolate. There was so much damage, so many collapsed buildings. Everything was grim. The food was quite limited. And when they got to London, similar, they would go to the train station and the roof was blown out. So they had this coming up short that we have gotten ourselves into something very serious here. So it was a big adjustment on both sides.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about some of the women. I just jotted down a few. You can throw it, because you've got, I think, an eclectic bunch, as you said, that have come over, and you've got some big names. You've got, of course, Helen Ritchie, who was Amelia Earhart's co-pilot in the 1936 Bendix, which we always have to mention on this show because it was won by Louise Thaden, who didn't come because she had 2 kids, and yeah. It's Louise. She can do whatever she wants, and we will never question what she does. But you've and Wood as well, who we'll talk about more in a bit, because she's sort of becomes your sort of main thrust of the second half of the book. But who were these women? Because I knew a few of them, but people like Dorothy Fury and Virginia Farr, of course, whose name does get mentioned when the ATA comes up. Amazing bunch, and what drive these women had.
Part of the issue with your reaction was that there was very little coverage of them. And I really had to dig deep and try to locate the families of these pilots. And I was very fortunate that many of them went up into attics and brought me diaries, letters, memorabilia, things that no one outside their families had ever seen. So, I just had this story to myself. And what I learned about them all was so intimate. They were so candid in their diaries and letters about their emotions and their personal lives and their flying, that I got such a rich and deep story about them all, which was great because they were a very diverse group that you would never guess if you didn't have all this information. We'll start with Dorothy Fury. She came from an impoverished background in New Orleans. She had an 8th grade education. She left school to work at the age of 14. What she did have going for her was that she was very intelligent and self-educated. She had read well. She was also a stunning beauty who made a huge impression on everyone who met her. She was the only one who joined the ATA without an invitation from Jackie Cochran. She heard about it at an airfield where she was a flight instructor. And she had a fiancé who owned a car that she would borrow because she had bartered her car in exchange for flying lessons. She asked if she could borrow the car. She drove it from New Orleans to Montreal. She sent him a telegram saying, "Sorry, I took your car. I sold it because I needed money. Needless to say, the marriage is off." She then tried out for the ATA and joined. Now, what was interesting about her is that she understood in a very sophisticated way that she could go to England and completely reinvent herself. She was beautiful. She was well educated by herself. She had a very imperious way about her. So immediately upon arrival in England, everyone assumed she was some sort of American aristocrat, and she was treated as such. Immediately moved into the highest circles of British society. There was a British lord who gave a ball for the entire airbase for the express purpose of getting an introduction to Dorothy Fury. She was often portrayed later in the British press, where she became quite a subject of tabloid scandal, as an American heiress, they would call her. But none of this was true. She was someone who was able to pass as a completely different person by being in a war in a completely different country.
Yeah, she definitely causes stirs, especially a bit later on with Anthony Eden and people like that.
We won't even touch that here. We could spend all day on any of these people, but I do sum it up ultimately in the book. Her many moves up the social ladder.
Yes. She works the British class system very well indeed. I think is a good way to do it. Winnabelle Pierce. She's another one who sort of leaps off the page as well. Very, very fiery, it seems, but also just determined to get her hands on whatever aircraft was in front of her. Because I suppose we should maybe just say that you didn't show up and immediately get given a Spitfire or a Lancaster or things. You had to prove your way up through the types, didn't you? So I think it was her that you sort of have these wonderful bits where she's sort of chomping at the bit, feeling that she's being held back from getting the fast stuff, isn't she?
Well, her arch rival was Virginia Farr, who we should probably get to next. The two of them were competing to be the first to be advanced to the higher classes of aircraft. That's how the system worked. You would be trained on one aircraft in each category, the first being just light, open cockpit aircraft, the next being fighters like the Hurricane and the Spitfire. They would learn to fly one version of each type, and then they would move on. From there, they would go on to two-engine bombers. Ultimately, there were four-engine bombers. So Winnabelle was very, very competitive. She was also a thrill seeker. She had become a pilot because she loved the thrill of it. She was, some would say, reckless. Some would say daring. She didn't pay much attention to the rules or the norms. In the ATA, she often broke the rules in the air and on the ground. She was the ringleader of those who made the worst impression on the British because she was a wild party girl. She had many love affairs. She was always at the epicenter of some kind of drama. So she was part of that bad first impression. And all of the Americans quickly realized they had made a bad impression. And they also realized the only way they could save themselves was to prove themselves in the air, which Winnie Pierce succeeded in doing. I'll tell a brief story about the most dramatic incident fairly early in her tenure. She had just been cleared to fly fighters. She was flying a Hurricane for, I think, about the third time. Those who know about the ATA know that it was very dangerous to fly in the ATA because they would fly new aircraft that often failed because they weren't really adequately tested. They would also fly damaged aircraft back from the front that had major problems, doors blown off, tape holding things together. And they also were contending with the British weather, which was quietly changeable, and they were not allowed to use instruments to fly. So there were all kinds of reasons why ATA pilots were killed. 1 in 7 of them died in the course of their service. So it was not just a lark. Winnie had this third Hurricane. It was a brand new one. She took off and the engine failed immediately on takeoff. Now, this is considered by pilots to be about the worst thing that can happen to you. You're not high enough in the air or have enough speed to find a place to get down on a flat spot and glide using the momentum you have. The ATA instructed pilots in a situation like this to basically give up, go straight ahead and crash. It was your best chance of surviving. The worst chance of surviving, they felt, was to make what pilots call the impossible turn. That is, at a low speed, at a low altitude, to try to turn around completely and get back onto the airfield. Winnie had about a split second to decide what to do. Being Winnie, she broke the rules. She tried to make the impossible turn. It's the kind of thing that with a computer, maybe you could figure out all the precise permutations of wind speed as you made the turn and how much power you still had left. She did it on her own. She hit the ground with everyone in the airfield watching her completely safely. The aircraft was not even damaged. Everyone realized whatever they may have thought about her, whatever they thought of her behavior, they did recognize that she was a tremendous natural pilot. So she always had this dual image amongst all of the pilots of someone to beat in the air, but also someone who was pretty crazy on the ground. And perhaps that craziness helped save her in the air. Who knows?
The Pima Air and Space Museum in Tucson, Arizona is home to one of the largest non-government funded aviation and space museums in the world. Featuring nearly 400 aircraft, the museum is home to an incredible collection like NASA's NB-52 X-15 dropship and 747 SP Sophia Airborne Observatory, to a wealth of rare military types from air forces all around the world, to the first production 777. Whether you are military or civilian aviation geek, there will be an incredible aircraft around every corner of this epic 80-acre site for you to explore. As the Aviation Show's partnership with the Pima Air and Space Museum enters its third year, we're delighted to say that Pima is truly a top of your bucket list museum to visit. And it keeps getting better, as this year the Tucson Military Vehicle Museum will be opening right next door. To find out more about the incredible collection and the fantastic events coming up at the Pima Air and Space Museum, and of course the Tucson Military Vehicle Museum, head over to www.pimaair.org to plan your trip to one of the world's great aviation collections, and one that now includes tanks next door, if that's your sort of thing. So we must get on to Virginia, because their rivalry is fun. And the ATA, especially the women's section, there's a lot of these rivalries going around, because you've also got famously Anna Leska and Margot Duham, who famously had a dog fight that was called a cat fight above Hamble when they got in each other's way trying to land. What about Winnabelle and Virginia? Well, let's talk about Virginia for a minute before we
talk about her. I think the rivalry was mostly one way. I think wanted to beat Virginia. I think Virginia just knew she was good. She was a member of the family of the Western Union fortune, one of the largest fortunes in America at the time, the tech giant of its age. She was raised to be a debutante and marry into one of the other wealthy families, as her cousins did, Roosevelt's, Auchinclosses. That was her job. The problem for Virginia was that she was attracted to women, not to men. It was about the worst situation to be in when your whole life purpose is to capture a man. When she learned to fly, she felt so free from all of that. All of the pilots felt tremendous freedom from being able to fly. And when she went to the war, she was able to escape that gilded cage of her family's expectations and live as she pleased. She had love affairs with other women, and I won't tell the end of her story, but she was able to live the life she wanted. She was also a rock-solid pilot. Winnie Pierce was an example of a bold, daring pilot. She was young, not super experienced. Virginia Farr was also quite young, but an example of what the instructors all admired. She was careful, she was serious, she followed all the instructions. So as they were being advanced through the training, Virginia Farr always advanced just a little bit ahead of Winnie Pierce. She was the first American to fly a fighter. She was the first American by far to fly a bomber. She was often assigned to very difficult air bases in difficult terrain where only the most competent pilots would be assigned.
You're allowed to say Scotland. It's...
Well, yes. But there were some also in Northern England that were pretty rough, where the weather was bad. They were near maintenance depots, so she often flew damaged aircraft back. She made many landings on farmers' fields when aircraft would fail in the air. She didn't mess up. So she was another example of a very different personality in this group.
There's so many similarities between them, and yet the differences as well is, I think, where a lot of the color of your book comes through. Is they're doing similar things, but the way they go about them, the lives that they're having while they're here in England and the UK as well, are very, very varied, aren't they? There's love, there's loss, there's everything, the whole gamut. What were some of the stories? Again, dear listener, if you go buy the book, you have to do it. But what was one or two that sort of leapt out at you along the way before we get on to Anne Wood and because I sort of want to hold her for a minute, because she really does grab the reins of the, we'll call it the American section of the ATA.
Mm-hmm.
Mm.
When you talk about love and loss, Mary Zerbel, the person we
Mm.
heard about at the beginning, who married very early in her service in England to an American pilot who was only 19, who had gone over to join the Eagle Squadron. This was before the U.S. had pilots over there, and he wanted to be a pilot in the war. So he joined this squadron for Americans who wanted to fly, and he was the pilot of a bomber in the North Sea. I won't say exactly what happened, but many of the women became involved with bomber pilots. They met a lot of them. And this was a very treacherous, romantic thing to do, because we all know that these pilots have very poor chances of uh, getting out without being killed, injured, or captured. So there are several stories that work out differently with the American women pilots and their involvement with some of these people, and the different outcomes that occurred. But all of them persevered through tragedies, through loss. Uh, they often saw their job as getting back in the air and helping to win the war, no matter what happened. So that's one aspect. There's also, I don't know, we've already talked about romances of Winnie and Dorothy.
Yeah, we can't talk about too many of Dorothy's romances. We'll be
Yes,
here all night.
yeah, it's like Jackie Cochran. We'd be here all day. So there were a lot of those kinds of stories. And there was one pilot who was very clean living. She was a minister's daughter. Her name was Nancy Miller, and she never touched alcohol. She spent her evenings studying aviation magazines in her room so that she would be up to speed. And she had herself transferred around to all sorts of uh, remote places. Scotland comes up again. Uh, because she wanted to fly as many aircraft as possible and have that record at the end of the war, to show that she could fly anything that was out there. So she had a large number of different aircraft she flew. She also, while she was a good girl on the ground, she became sort of a bad girl in the air. In order to fly more missions, she did learn on her own how to fly using instruments, and did fly using instruments frequently, which was against the rules in the APA. And many of the other pilots did it as well. They wanted to come out alive, and so they did ignore that instruction more and more as the war went on. But Nancy was interesting in that she avoided having a boyfriend. She was really serious because she was so focused on a post-war career, which they all were. This was throughout the story. It's always an underwriting aspect of it, what they were doing to try to maneuver so that when the war ended, they would be in a position to be able to fly, which for women was not a guarantee.
Because we must point out, they were on a contract as well, weren't they?
Yes.
Was it 18 months that they signed?
Yes, they were on 18-month contracts, and then they could renew the contracts later. They were really very well treated compared to how they would have been treated in the United States. They were well paid. When they first arrived, they were paid 20% less than men. But as women advanced to the most advanced aircraft, Pauline Gower went to Parliament and made the case that they should receive equal pay. Parliament passed a law. It was the first of its kind, a gender parity law, and it was, I don't know, decades before there were any others. So these pilots were so admired for their bravery and skill that they were the first to achieve equal pay. And they were respected. But it was kind of like a feminist utopia for a while there. It was like they went through a window into the future.
Yeah.
They were able to pursue these challenging careers and be treated well doing it. They were able to live personal lives as they chose. I was always struck by how much they were like women today, having a lot of choices and deciding what they wanted their life to be. During the war, they had that opportunity.
That's perfect, because that really does bring us nicely onto Anne, because she very much has a focus on the future throughout the whole thing, doesn't she? And she very quickly learns from Jackie Cochran as well how to network and make use of those contacts and sort of fit into that sort of de facto leadership role when Cochran comes home, doesn't she?
Yes, Anne Wood was another example of someone who passed for something she wasn't. Everyone called her a Philadelphia socialite, and I've read things recently that called her that. In fact, she was born in Philadelphia. That was true, and she had kind of a Tony accent. She sounded like Katharine Hepburn, but her father had died when she was young, and her mother had taken her family to Belgium to educate them because it would be less expensive. And then they moved to Waldoboro, Maine, a small town. So she always had this veneer of a Philadelphia socialite while not having that life at all. She was president of her college class because she was always ambitious. And she knew she had to get a job to support her family, her younger brothers and sisters. So after the war, her mother noticed that there were free flying lessons nearby, and they couldn't fill the entire class with men. And there was one slot, they gave it to her. But when she went to England, she was very much like someone today, man or woman, who decides to network to have a career. She had very polished social manners. She could get along with anybody. On her leave days, she was always in London, and she had a network of connections. They were diplomats, journalists, generals, spies, businessmen who were profiting off the war. She knew everybody and cultivated these friendships, knowing that they might pay off later, because she wanted a serious kind of managerial job later in life. She wanted to work for government or business or something where she could be in charge of stuff. She was good at that. And when Jackie Cochran left, Anne Wood became the de facto leader of the American women. She arranged their parties. She would look after them when they were injured in the hospital, get them transferred to the best place for treatment. She would take charge of all kinds of situations. So she, toward the end of the war, more and more worked to try to make the connections to have this career that she dreamed about.
They achieve so much in this sort of relatively short period of time, and there's interesting parallels. You've got that fantastic. Oh, I'll wave it again. On the cover, you've got the fantastic picture of them with the Polish flyers as well. There's these fantastic international parallels throughout it all, and the thing that struck me from reading your book is these are the ones whose home is very, very different to everybody else. And, the reason I say that is because by this time, by the time we get to 43, the WASPs are starting to come online as well. Are they looking at what the alternative is back in the States and comparing and contrasting? Because the WASPs had a very different experience to this very select group in the ATA.
Yes, the Americans in the ATA very much followed what was happening in the United States with the WASP, because they recognized that that would affect opportunities for women after the war back home. And they could see immediately that the WASP experience was very different. The American public was always leery about the idea of women flying. So from the very beginning, there was opposition to the fact that the WASP even existed. They had a very different life. The Americans in Britain had a very freewheeling life. They kind of did what they pleased. They were in charge of making the decisions about whether to take off or not. It was their call due to weather or whatever. They had a lot of independence. In the WASP, they lived in barracks, kind of in the middle and nowhere, Texas, Oklahoma. They certainly couldn't go to London and dance at the clubs on their nights off the way that women in England could. And they were very regimented. They didn't get to fly as many different aircraft. They might be trained on one or two and fly it repeatedly. They also sometimes towed targets for target practice. So they would just go back and forth in an aircraft towing a target. all the Americans were keeping track of it, thinking they might go back at the end of their contracts to join the WASP, but most of them decided they loved being in the center of the action in England and the way they were treated. Like the WASP, for example, if one of them was killed, the others took up a collection to send the body home. They were just not looked after in the way that the pilots were in Great Britain. So it ultimately became quite depressing when, at the end of 1942, with the war still raging, the United States ended the WASP program because of public concerns that these women would take jobs away from men after the war. So those who had gone back to join the WASP, and there were some who did, were now out of a job. And it made the pilots in my story realize that they were going to be up against a lot more opposition than they expected when the war ended and they went back home.
You see that towards the end of your book as well, where their minds are very much, and I guess this is where their diaries became so fascinating, is that what's next sort of thing. Because through most of those years, it's get up, fly multiple times during the day, sleep, do it again, head to town, have some fun, fly. Mm-hmm. But once that end is getting closer, that was very palatable in your book, was to see this concern, this uncertainty of what going home would mean for them.
Right. And the job in the ATA was very meaningful too. I liked connecting it with what was going on in the war in general. For example, D-Day, so much of the success was the fact that the Allies owned the airspace on that day. And that was because of great advanced preparation. All these pilots in the weeks before were delivering all kinds of aircraft, new aircraft to them, the kind that would support the invasion. Nancy Miller said she flew 18 different brand new types of aircraft in that month. So they felt that they were having an impact, doing something important, doing what they loved. The idea that it would end, of course, they wanted the war to end, but for themselves, it was quite worrisome what would happen to them next.
Because it's, I suppose we should mention, how did they feel when they got told that they weren't allowed to go to the continent and only men could ferry aircraft to the forward air bases?
Well, they were frustrated, of course. And of course, the people like Ann Wood, she started using her connections like crazy in order to be the first one to go. And in fact, she was a very early person to go. And toward the end of the war, she spent a lot of time in Paris, Brussels, and even she got to Germany. And that was also something, her diaries were excellent. And they were such a new and different description of what the war had wrought on the continent, the tremendous destruction that had occurred. She was seeing it through fresh eyes that I found very interesting. Of course, the very first one to cross the channel was your favorite, Diana Barnado, the British pilot, who worked her connections to be able to do it.
I think it was more her and her husband just borrowing a couple airplanes and going as well. She's fantastic and lived just up the road from here. As an aside, and also when you know her family, it's completely within keeping that attitude, because her dad is a remarkable man as well. If you ever wonder what happened to the De Beers fortune, well, Wolf Bernardo spent it on Bentley twice. So there you go. That's an aside for a different podcast. I think I wasn't sure what I was expecting when your book came in, because the ATA is one of those almost like sacred things of the Second World War, especially here of what they've achieved. But the way you've brought this known group to life is fantastic, and I think all of the women you talk about just leap off the page. But I was sort of wondering, now that the book's escaped into the world and you're doing the press for it and things, looking back on it, what's your lasting memories? Is there something else you wish you could have squeezed in but didn't quite make it? Maybe what's your memories?
What you mean? Or yeah.
Or just what's your lasting memories of the project as you went through it?
Well, I'll mention one thing we haven't talked about. Really, I think I got everything I wanted for this book. It was such a dream story. I mean, it took me 5 years. It was hard. But one of the things that I do remember, and I hope it doesn't show in the book, was that when I described dramatic scenes of aviation, I had to rely on very cut and dried note cards that the RAF had kept on crashes and things that didn't explain much. And I would draw on the diaries as well. But I also developed a little advisory group of historic aviation enthusiasts some who had actually flown these aircraft, and they would advise me. So I would tell them, all right, my pilot was in a situation where there was an oil leak, and as a result, the propeller fell off the plane at 1,000 feet. You are the pilot. What are you thinking? What are your options? What are you doing? And they could talk me through it so I could tell those stories in a way that you didn't have to be an aviation expert to understand what was happening. And you see it from the point of view of the pilot, and it's part of the story. So that was one of my favorite aspects of this. Each of these dramatic crashes, and there were several, as you know, took weeks of work to do those few pages so that it would be accurate and capture the emotions that the character would be going through while experiencing this. So I would say that was one of my fond memories of the project. These people who helped me, I couldn't have done it without them.
Oh, that's nice. It comes alive off the page. It raced by. It didn't take. I'm going to say this and wave my fingers. When I say it didn't take me long to read, as in I read it quickly, as in I couldn't put it down. That's what I meant to say. That was the easier way. But it's fantastic. So I guess with that, what would you like people to take away from the book?
Well, I would like young people to take away that if you're in a world where people don't expect someone like you to achieve something, these were people where the expectations of the time were so low for them, and what they achieved was so incredible. I mean, they would fly up to 147 different models of aircraft, often seeing them for the first time as they got into the cockpit. They were tremendously skilled and brave. So I would like young people reading it to see that this sort of thing can be done. A lot of people at my book signings ask me to sign it to young people in their lives for that reason, and I enjoy that very much. And older people, I would like them to realize that there's history that we don't necessarily know about that's really meaningful. I was surprised to come across this. I would think we know everything there is to know about World War II at this point. Here's this big, complicated, dramatic story that's never been told. So I would just wonder what else is out there to be discovered.
Okay, to wrap up, Sophie's choice question: who is your favorite?
Ask me that. I cannot have a favorite. I cannot. They're all my favorites. I got to know them so intimately. I knew all their innermost thoughts. I knew their personalities so well. When I wrote the last page, I was so sad about how much I would miss them. They were all people who would be great friends in my life. And I mean that in the sense that sometimes you have a great friend and you think they're making some bad choices. I don't approve, but I understand them. I know where they came from, so I understand why they're doing it, and they're still my friend. There were some that I felt nothing but admiration, and others I felt support for. I know what you're going through. You did the best you could here. So, yeah, I'm not picking one. Sorry, you lose on that one.
It was a mean question. I apologize, but
who's your favorite?
Who's my favorite? I think it's Anne. I think just the way she seizes that opportunity after Jackie Cochran goes home. She's had that glimpse. She's already knows how to work a room, but just the way she ensured she was working her way through the right way, but also that she was making sure the opportunities were coming up for the others as well. I thought that went to some of her to her character, and I was fascinated by that.
It's interesting that even she struggled right after the war at first, and I won't say what happens, but it's interesting who steps up to help her of all her many connections.
Yes. Read the book. What's the full title of the book, Becky? Let's get the plug in to wrap up.
It is Spitfires, the American Women Who Flew in the Face of Danger During World War II. And there it is.
There it is. And it is out now. I think I'll have to double check. I think it's out here in the UK, or is it coming out in July?
Last I heard, it's coming out in June, and I don't know if it's out at this moment, but that's what I heard. I should have checked before I came on.
I should have checked as well. It's my job. But anyway, this is it. It's fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us. I'll put I'll put a little thing in the bottom if it's not out in the UK just yet, when that is. But pre-order it.
Get papers about it very recently, so I don't know if it's all the I's are dotted at this point, but they may be now.
Super. Well, I'll make sure to re-plug when it's said. Becky, thank you so much for taking your lunchtime to chat with me.
Well, thank you. I enjoyed it very much, and I respect you. You did pick a favorite. That was bold.
I felt I had to, because you didn't. One of us had to. But yeah, they're all fantastic, and you're right. That each one, just the way you find out that little bit more, and of course Virginia's life as well is a superb tale. Thank you for taking the time to talk to me.
Thank you. I enjoyed it.
I can't thank Becky Aikman enough for joining us here on the Aviation Show. Spitfires, the American Women Who Flew in the Face of Danger During World War II, is out now in the US, and you can get it here in the UK on Amazon. There seems to be a little bit of a delay with the release here, but it is available, and I thoroughly enjoyed every page of it. So many thanks to Becky, and thanks to Amanda and the team at Bloomsbury. Of course, if you like these episodes early, become a channel member or join us over on the Patreon, where we've got lots of things going on. Of course, if you join on Patreon, we'll throw in a little welcome pack with keychains, thank you cards, and all that good stuff. Links are all in the description below. All starts from about £3 a month, plus a bit of that. And that's my bit out of the way. All your support is incredible. Like and subscribe. So until next time, thank you so much for watching. Do check out our other videos, and until next time, take care of yourselves. Bye-bye. I'd like to say thanks to all of our fantastic supporters over on Patreon. If you head over to our Patreon page, you can join the fun from just £3 a month, plus a bit of VAT, get your name in these very credits, and get all the episodes ad-free and early as soon as I get the edit finished. The Aviation Show is hosted and produced by Matt Bone and is a Boney Abroad production.